This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On April 27, 2016, the Institute held a public conference on the theme of threat and preparedness in Canada. 9 distinguished specialists in 3 panels addressed the gathering. This is the podcast of Panel 1. Panels 2 and 3 follow in separate videos.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I echo the comments of the President and of Colonel Corrigan in welcoming you all here today, and in advance thanking the panels for taking their time and making the trek to, I think we call it the 6 now, for some reason. Some may say that terrorism or violent extremism in the Canadian context is an overly exaggerated fear, and that professing such estimations are doing so in order to exploit a political or ideological agenda. Others may say that the current lethality, tempo, and trends of terrorist organizations and those willing to inflict unbridled carnage lead to an apocalyptic conclusion. The truth, as my learned colleague Dr. Bernard Lewis reverently would point out, is in its usual position. Are we in crisis? The world is a very vulnerable place at the moment. Africa and the Middle East are now relegated to mere mention. Asia is dominated by an apparently inexorable Korean aggression, and Europe's self-annihilation through self-imposed cultural genocide is having the desired effect. Few democratic islands remain amongst a few, of course, Canada, Israel, America, the United States, notwithstanding the next election, of course. And there are those, even perhaps amongst us in this room, that would believe that Canada has not nor ever will be victim to the kind of violence and extremism that we have recently witnessed elsewhere. Our history of human rights, respect for law, cultural diversity, peacekeeping, social justice movements, and levels of education all should act as a fail-safe against such a cataclysmic concept. Or will it? Conversely, there are those who would point out that Canada has already seen its share of violent acts that prove we are not immune from those who would do us harm. From the Fenians to the FLQ, the Squamish Five, the Sikhs, Serbians, Armenians, Croatians, radicalized Islamists, to name a few, Canada has been victim to terrorism for decades. Are we at risk? Has that risk increased? What are the threats? And are we prepared? Apart from the resounding threat of extremism, more mundane menaces of IT interruption, natural occurring phenomenon, corporate espionage, and criminal enterprise continue to pose a threat to our infrastructure. This panel will examine these questions based on their particular background, experience, and expertise. Each will provide an opening statement, followed by a panel discussion on the notions expressed. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce them to you now, and of course, as indicated, their in-depth biographies are available in your program. Mr. Andy Ellis, former Assistant Director of Operations for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Mr. John Thompson, Strategic Capital Intelligence Group, Director of the RCMI, and Mr. Alan Bell, President of Globe Risk International. I would ask that Mr. Andy Ellis open the panel discussion.
Thank you, Stu. I just thought I'd like to say something at the start that you notice that there's biographies in your booklet, and if you go to mine, if anybody wants later on, I'm willing to sign my photograph that's there. I know it's pretty popular. To follow on what Stu was saying, I think my comments, and it's interesting to say I retired in January of this year, and you know, as an employee of the government, you're under a certain amount of restriction on what you can say and how you can say it. My comments are my own and are probably the findings of about 30 years of service with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. The threats that our collective societies face in today's world are myriad and diverse. While many would see the menace of espionage, spying, as having been defeated with the cessation of the Cold War, countries continue to clandestinely gather intelligence to advance their national interests. Cyber threats, in all their forms, can plague the well-being of our citizens. Cybercrime, especially when it involves the exploitation of vulnerable persons, is more widespread than ever. The covert and clandestine theft of protected and proprietary online information puts the financial security of our nation at risk every day. Cyber is also being used by nation states and terrorist organizations as a tool of traditional espionage and warfighting. Hostile nations use their often overwhelming technical power of the intelligence services to enable the theft of information, which enhances the competitive edge of their own national entities at the expense of ours. While yet to be realized to devastating effect, online terrorism has the potential to be far more dangerous than the guns and bombs used today. International terrorism remains the single most serious national security threat to our society. The causes of terrorism are diffuse as the groups are as diffuse as the groups that practice it. The results are sadly similar: death, destruction, and fear. The Islamic State, properly referred to by the Arabic acronym Daesh, has emerged as the first truly 21st century terrorist organization. If not the most violent and dreadful terrorist organization in history, it has the potential and desire to be so. There is literally no limit to what the Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is willing to undertake, or more accurately, to encourage others to undertake on his behalf. The unprovoked murder of Shia, Christians, Yazidis, women, homosexuals, vicious and unrelenting attacks, beheadings, executions, crucifixions, burning at the stake, binding and throwing people off the tops of high towers. That is what they're willing to do in theater. What are they willing to do elsewhere? Rampaging through the streets of Paris, killing innocents with automatic weapons and explosive vests, murdering unsuspected office colleagues at a party in San Bernardino, the heinous attack on unarmed Canadian soldiers, leaving a hero's corpse draped over the tomb of the unknown soldier in our nation's capital. That's what they've done. Their dreams and aspirations make these attacks look minor by comparison. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi himself has promised to expand the territorial reach of Daesh. By 2019, ISIL is committed to control territory in Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, the Sinai, and the Gulf states. Is it a fantasy? Probably. Is it a dream? Yes. But I think we all need to come to the realization that every dream and every desire that ISIL has had so far has been realized. Daesh has affiliates and supporters who have sworn bayat to the caliphate around the globe. From their stranglehold of Libya and soon other parts of the Maghreb to the fertile recruitment grounds of Afghanistan, not to mention what could be established in war-ravaged Yemen and with affiliated organizations in East Africa and Southeast Asia. One of the interesting things and one of the interesting discussion pieces is, what's the difference between Daesh and AQ? What are we talking about? Are they the same people? They're both Islamist extremists. They're both Sunni. They both have their history in the Ikhwan Muslimin and the Muslim Brotherhood. But that's kind of where it stops. If you look at Al-Qaeda, they're an elitist organization. They're a professional terror organization. They vet people before they join, they test them when they've joined, and they retest them again to ensure that they can be trusted. What's Daesh? It's a populist organization. It's open to everyone. All comers are welcome. It's a different approach, it's a different recruitment approach, and it's a different ideology. With Al-Qaeda, traditionally, they had been mass casualty oriented. Let's hit the biggest targets we can, as often as we can, to leave the biggest impact that we can. Daesh had a different perspective. Daesh looked at it and said, let's hit as many targets in any way we can with whatever weapons we have and whatever tools we have at our disposal. The real difference that you see is in the propaganda and the recruitment. We've all seen the grainy black and white videos of Osama bin Laden in a cave droning on for hours in Arabic, quoting scripture and theses from different Islamic scholars that he decided to follow. You don't see that with Daesh. You see young people, bright, articulate, speaking the language of the people whom they are trying to send their propaganda to. The message that they're leaving has far greater effect. Interestingly enough, Daesh and Al-Qaeda have started to move toward each other. They see each other actually as competitors. Daesh looks at Al-Qaeda and says, knocking down the World Trade Center and hitting the Pentagon had an enormous impact. Maybe we can look at mass casualty. Maybe we can bring people into our organization who have an elite skill set, a subset of that greater populist movement. Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, is looking at the Daesh message and saying, we need to use public media more effectively. We need to use social media. We need to be able to publish things. They're still struggling with it. They put out online magazines that they hope will have the same effect that Daesh has. A magazine to our children and grandchildren bear no resemblance to the social media that Daesh is able to bring to bear. What does this mean for law enforcement and intelligence services? Best example I can give is, I'm a football fan, so excuse me if I use a football reference. But normally, when an offense starts to come at you, you have to set up a defense and design a defense that's aimed to stop that particular offense. So if you're going to set up a defense against Tom Brady of the New England Patriots, what are you going to do? Here's a guy who sits in the pocket, who's a very accurate passer, who's very precise, very smart, very organized. So you set up a defense the best you can to deal with that guy who's going to stand in the pocket. The next week you have to play the Seattle Seahawks and you're playing against Russell Wilson. Creative, innovative, running all over the place, unpredictable. You never know where he's going to come from. In today's world, an analogy can be drawn that we're playing against Russell Wilson and Tom Brady at the same time. We're looking at two different devastating attack vectors coming at us from different directions in different fashions and different styles. So therefore you have to set up your defense. You need to spread your defense a lot more thin in order to find those different vectors and to be able to establish yourself, to be able to counter it as it comes at you. This is something certainly in my service that I had never experienced before. Penetrating Al-Qaeda, when you plan for 5 years to make something happen, the devastating effect if you fail is horrendous, and 9/11 showed that. But you have an opportunity because they're planning and they're communicating. When Daesh sends out a wide message to anyone who will listen to it to do whatever they can, the impact is less. The likelihood is greater because there's more people who are willing to carry out that terrorist attack on their behalf. Current estimates suggest that Daesh can call in as many as 30,000 volunteers from upwards of 90 nations in Iraq and Syria. While originally Daesh had a predominantly Iraqi and Syrian group, it is now the world's most diverse terrorist organization. It is estimated, and very broadly, that volunteers from Western nations can make up as many as 5,000 to 8,000 of these young volunteers. Not all Western people have come to the caliphate and are looking to be involved in combat operations. Many of the Canadians, for example, found their way into the propaganda wing of Daesh. I would argue that that may be equally as dangerous, maybe more, than someone who's joining the military wing. A lot of these young Western adherents to Daesh are put on the front lines and die very quickly. Someone who's working in the propaganda wing can hurt us over and over and over again. Who are these young people who are radicalized in the West? And why do they have such a burning desire to fight in a battle so far from home? What drives them? That's the $128,000 question. They're young, sometimes disenfranchised and disaffected, seeking a sense of belonging to something that they perceive to be greater than themselves. They're media savvy and connected. They're attracted by a sense of adventure, excitement, and purpose that the Daesh narrative and experience offers. They feel persecuted and very often moved by the Muslim persecution narrative that underlies much of the Daesh propaganda. Although having more effect to those born to Islam, the feeling of persecution is also very strongly felt by recent converts to the cause. They view the vast majority of peaceful, normal, reasonable Muslims as having abandoned their faith and their responsibility toward their fellow religionists. Reaching out and welcoming converts has been extremely successful for Daesh as compared to their competitors in Al-Qaeda. Mental illness and violence. While the link between mental illness and terrorism has been dismissed, experts are starting to rethink their previous findings. A populist organization such as Daesh will attract young adherents for many, many reasons. There's an increasing number of young people who have been drawn to the Daesh narrative who have a history of often severe mental illness. More often, these tend to be the lone actors, but this is an area that requires more study and, frankly, improved community resilience. This is not something that the police, that the intelligence services can manage alone. The issue of mentally ill adherence is more strongly felt, interestingly, in North America than it is in Europe. Viewing vivid violence and the promise of participation in these barbaric acts has unfortunately had a major factor in the radicalization and recruitment process. During my time with CSIS, we and many of our allies interviewed a lot of these people who were captured on the battlefield, who had returned to their countries of origin. And many of them, quote, being mesmerized by the abhorrent violence that they saw on screen. And there was something in that violence that drew them to participate in it. This is another area that we haven't got our head around yet. The number of people who watch these extraordinarily violent videos is increasing every day. The unsaid promise of sex, either legitimately through marriage to like-minded people in the caliphate or through the participation in pillage and rape, has also been cited, albeit privately, as a key recruitment driver by some veterans who have returned to their homes. I think it would be naive, and it's starting to come out now, to think that these people are holy warriors alone. The rape and pillage that's gone on across Iraq and Syria is unprecedented, certainly in the last few centuries. Their promised involvement in this, it's quiet, it tends to be in small groups, but that is also a drawing factor. And when we've spoken to some of these people, they cite that as something that drew them as well, the violence and the sexual violence. Canadian adherents to Daesh ideology come from all of these areas. While they share a desire to go to the caliphate to fight, to participate in the Great Hijra, and to move their families to the caliphate. According to recent testimony before Parliament, there are in the range of 100 plus in the Daesh theater of operations now, and more participating in war zones elsewhere. Who are these guys? How do we categorize them for law enforcement and intelligence services? We look at them in four different ways. The first, from a Canadian perspective, are those people in Canada who expressed a desire to go overseas and fight, to participate in the violence that's happening elsewhere. That's sort of category one. Category two are those people who have left the country and who have joined the caliphate, who are fighting with Daesh, with ISIL, and are on the ground. Category three, in lesser numbers, are those who've returned from the theater of operations. Interestingly enough, like in people who are involved in any conflict, those who return are not a homogeneous group of people. Some of them are more radicalized than they were before. Some of them are trying to get young people to join the organization. Yet some of them feel like they've completed their tour of duty and go on and go to work and raise their family and seem to disappear into the normal society. The fourth, and I would argue most dangerous segment that we look at, are frustrated jihadists. Zaif Bebo, the murderer of Corporal Cirillo, is one of those. He had a desire to go to the Middle East. He had a desire to fight with the caliphate. And pursuant to good judgment and the law, every effort was made by law enforcement and security services in this country to disrupt his ability to travel. It frustrated him. It angered him. He had a history of drug use, of some mental illness. This exasperation probably led to his violent outburst. Unfortunately, he's not the only one. There are many like him and many who share the same frustrations. And as we take it upon ourselves to follow that responsibility, to heed the responsibilities that we have in government to disrupt these people from going, the question is, what do you do with them? Who has responsibility to trust but verify? To ensure that this frustrated person doesn't act up and try to do something in this country or in, God forbid, in the country of one of our allies. There aren't enough resources in the world to cover all of the people that I've just listed. The prioritization of that is a challenging exercise, to say the least. The internet and the dark web. It's a relatively anonymous medium for lifetime access to the radicalization message. A place for jihadists in theater to upload their alleged heroic exploits. It's a radicalization and recruitment tool, but it's also a narcissistic ego stroke for the people who are in theater. They really like making these videos. It makes them feel good. It makes them feel important. It gives them, it meets some of the needs that they had before going to the caliphate in the first place. It's a medium to share without the fear of disruption of audio, video, and narrative messaging instantly and globally. In some cases, it's entirely secure, encrypted, clandestine communication platforms for our enemy. Applications are expanding exponentially while the debate on both sides of the issue moves at a snail's pace. Both sides of the debate have made viable arguments. Security versus privacy. A resolution is required that considers both paradigms before the network goes entirely dark. The last part of the dark web that we have to consider is something I mentioned before, and that's the as yet unrealized yet possible threat of cyber terrorism. Likelihood and impact. Daesh-inspired terrorist attacks will continue to take place. There will be more attacks in theater, North Africa, and unquestionably in Western Europe. Unfortunately, as San Bernardino, Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, and Ottawa have shown, Daesh-inspired and directed terrorists will continue to threaten North America. It isn't what we've seen in Europe, but rather a threat that's purpose-made for this culture and this geography. The number of adherents is growing. The number of jihadists and veterans returning from abroad continues to climb. And through the good work of security and law enforcement professionals, the number of young people who've been disrupted from leaving this country to participate in violent jihad is also increasing. What are the impacts of a terrorist attack in this country? Well, they're profound. It shakes the confidence of the population to live, to work, and to feel a sense of peace and security. It shakes the confidence in government and those whose job it is to protect us. What will this mean in terms of foreign investment? The security to look at a country like Canada and say, this is a good environment in which to put my limited resources. We're seeing it already in countries like Belgium and France. Multinational corporations hesitating before investing their resources into those countries. Am I willing to put my staff there? Am I willing to put, what is it going to mean in terms of security? What is it going to mean in terms of insurance? How am I going to get people to go there? The economic cost of terrorism is profound. The free flow of goods and services and the unrestricted commerce and open borders. Our economy, as well as those of our trading partners, depends on our ability to understand and to disrupt terrorism. The United States is our biggest trading partner and we are theirs. Closing the border is untenable. The lack of the ability to use aviation after 9/11, after the attacks in Belgium, I think speaks to that risk. Without the free flow of material and services, our economy is going to grind to a halt. Again, the costs of this are in blood and in treasure. To quote a former director of CSIS, the only thing worse than an attack in Canada is one that's planned and coordinated in Canada and executed in the United States. You can imagine what the impact of that would be. We have a person running for president right now who said that the 9/11 hijackers came from Canada. She's since rescinded those comments, but those comments still exist and those beliefs still exist. And that's something that was untrue. And 15 years after the events, people still believe it. Can you imagine the impact it would have if it was actually true? Following Chris's earlier comments, private and public sector risk models, risk mitigation, and disaster response models need to take into account the possibility that the new realities in which we live present. Look at Amazon or FedEx. You look at an organization whose entire business model is based on the movement of goods using aviation. Have these companies, have these enterprises built into their risk assessment the possibility of terrorism? The answer for the most part is no. Most companies say, well, the impact of terrorism is like getting hit by lightning. I suppose it is. But if aviation is disrupted for a day, for a week, what impact is that going to have on Amazon, on their business model, on their income that's coming into their country, into their company? It's going to be massive. Are they planning for that? Do they have a mitigation model? Do they have a disaster response? Have they hired out a fleet of trucks to enable them to move materials? And bear in mind that everybody's using the internet to order things online and to ship them now. This isn't just the DHLs and the FedExes of the world as it was in the 1990s. From Costco to Canadian Tire, many, many people are using that method in order to acquire goods. How does that continue? How does your company respond to that? I think it's a huge area that needs more exploration and frankly needs a better response from people like us who can provide the kind of advice I think that corporate enterprises could use in order to manage this risk more effectively. The threat of terrorism from organizations such as DICE presents new and sometimes unexpected challenges. This is not the first time that our nation has faced a daunting threat that seemed undefeatable. Unfortunately, this is not an issue that will simply go away by naively ignoring its existence. It is one that will require an integrated and focused response in Canada and abroad. Have no doubt, Daesh is our enemy and the enemy of our closest allies. Canada has always proven to be resilient in the face of peril, continuing to cling to our shared values of integrity, fairness, and equity have always underpinned the success of our pluralistic society. Thank you.
I think most of you are, or a good many of you are, security professionals of one kind or another, or have been at various times. And you've probably all heard the opinion that Canada is a peaceful nation and we've never had anything to worry about. Which usually means, when you hear that opinion expressed, means a complete ignorance of our history. Canada was defined by decades of almost continuous frontier warfare between the French and the English, with natives on both sides, a dimension of the Anglo-French struggle for supremacy in Europe and globally. We forget often that the American Revolution created two countries for the price of one. Of our 10 provincial capitals, 3 have been occupied by hostile forces in wartime. 2 were founded as strategic naval bases, and 1 was built by refugees as a garrison town. Military considerations are responsible for Ottawa being sited where it is. We forget that our political and economic maturity more or less came around in the 2 world wars. We also, of course, forget the numerous private non-state actors that have had a violent influence on our history. Father Le Loutre, egging on the Micmac and the Acadians in Nova Scotia in the 1740s. A century later, in the 1840s, the Hunters Lodges coming over the U.S. border and again causing disturbances in Canada, including a couple of one pitched fight. Next June is the 150th anniversary of the Fenian raid on the Niagara Peninsula and the Battle of Ridgeway. And of course the Fenians were a never-present security threat around Confederation. Those of you who were in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, you would know about the history of the whiskey traders in the Canadian West, the reason why the Northwest Mounted Police were created in the first place, and the stellar role of the early Mounties in dealing with refugee Sioux on the run from U.S. cavalry after the Little Bighorn. Now, these are all parts of our history, and we forget them. Actually, I did some counting, and there are, in the history of Canada before 1815, 135 known battles, sieges, and raids on Canadian territory. We've had a very violent past. We've also, of course, been capable of creating our own internal problems. The Upper and Lower Canadian rebellions, violent competition between the Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay out in the Canadian West. They might have been civil in their boardrooms, but it was a cutthroat business out on the prairies in every which way. Also on the prairies, the Pemmican War, the 1870, the problems of the Métis in Manitoba, the Riel Rebellion, and we forget about some of the other wars that occurred, for example, in the interior of British Columbia, the Fraser Canyon and the Chilcotin Wars. In Canadian history, we have the Gavazi riots in Montreal. We also have the Jubilee riots in Toronto. And that's just some of the examples of some of the episodes of violent rioting we've seen. So it should come as no surprise to also learn that Canada has a long acquaintance with terrorism. Now, right off the bat, when we start talking about terrorism, we start talking about the usual problem of terrorism, and the biggest one is definition. Back in 1998, Brian Jenkins, who was at the time one of the world's foremost analysts of terrorism, wrote a book on the subject, of course, and tried to define it. Violence, or equally important, the threat of violence, used and directed in service of, used and directed in pursuit of or in service of a political aim. That's really kind of loose. That was the problem. If you got exact in your definition of terrorism, you missed a lot of activities. If you stayed loose, you could encompass everything, but it was so loose it'd be almost meaningless. You consider the definition that Canada adopted when we were debating the passage of our terrorism laws in 2001, 2002. It was really kind of loose. Now take a look at Section 83 of the Criminal Code and just see how that loose definition has had to be nailed down by pages and pages of regulation. Terrorism is an extraordinarily complicated subject. Part of the problem with the definition of terrorism is that it's, my little tagline when I'm doing the talking head stuff on television is that it's a realm with fuzzy borders that intersects with other activities. Protest, insurgency, organized crime, and sometimes special operations by agencies of a government. That's been known from time to time. Terrorism can include rioters who deliberately plan to foment violence. Impulsive violence in a riot, that's maybe not terrorism. But if you went to the riot with Molotov cocktails in your gym bag and pre-stocked iron bars, you're edging into the realm of terrorism. You're planning on using violence. Strikers in a bitter dispute who deliberately try to murder replacement workers. Purposeful vandalism for a single issue cause. And again, we've seen a lot of examples of that. I think one of the most common forms of this violence is by the Animal Liberation Front. It intersects with crime. Again, most terrorist groups, if they mature to a certain level, use organized crime to pay for their activities, but we also have criminals who will seek to intimidate law enforcement officials or the judges in general, not just for their own narrow interest in their own case. MS-13 has been trying to come to Canada. They've made it clear that if they had a chance, they would seek to do what they've been doing in Central America and start murdering police officers. That's something to consider if they ever actually get around to establishing a foothold here. Or we have the case again of bikers in Quebec that were trying to intimidate the prison guards to make sure that they had free access to whatever they wanted when behind bars. We can all recognize terrorism when it comes to something like planning truck bombs or trying to derail trains. That's very recognizable. But in other cases, the motive for terrorism isn't always necessarily political. We say it's political, but many terrorists have worn some sort of cause like a hat. The revolution, the triumph of the people, the cause of the Ummah might be part of the enabling architecture of somebody's violent episode, but the true motivation for suddenly running people over with a truck or walking into a shopping mall with a shotgun might be something else. Usually some gratification of a need for recognition, a revenge for an imagined slight, or a fantasy of some kind. And this is one of the definitional issues we have today with terrorism, is there's often a desire when a terrorist attack occurs to find something other than blaming it on a terrorist cause especially these days if the jihad is involved. However, this is an old story. In the 1890s, it was the complaint of European anarchists that the person who lobbed a bomb into a restaurant or just shot a head of state and described himself as an anarchist was unknown to them. He didn't subscribe to their journals, didn't hang around their debating societies, and couldn't call himself an anarchist. But we let the anarchist movement wear the hat for these attacks. The same thing we'll do now for the jihadists. If somebody launches an attack, says it's for the jihad, then the jihad gets the credit, as they do for the killing of Warrant Officer Vincent and Corporal Cirillo. However, recognizing terrorism when we experience it is difficult for another reason. Again, terrorism has these fuzzy boundaries that intersect with other activities, and that boundary is hard to define. For about 5 years, in 2000 and 2005, I spent 2 days a week watching pornography for the public on the Ontario Film Review Board. And what was interesting there, in comparison to the study of terrorism, was that, again, where is the boundary between art and obscenity? When does something become free expression, transfer over to pornography? It's very, very hard to define, and also everybody has their own idea on the subject. When it comes to terrorism, again, many of us, especially those of us who pay a lot of attention, will have a very narrow interpretation of what terrorism is. Other people don't, and that makes generating a record of attacks very, very difficult. However, if we look back over the last 150 years, we actually do have quite a track record of terrorism in Canada. A year after Confederation, in 1868, D'Arcy McGee, a Canadian Member of Parliament, was shot to death in Ottawa by a Fenian sympathizer. It says a lot about the decency of Canada that it took over 100 years before we had our second political murder, and that was Pierre Laporte in 1970. But that didn't mean this was a quiet century. We had 3 murders connected with Sikh nationalists in Vancouver in 1914. A police officer who was an expert on the precursor to the Barba-Khalsa, and 2 expert witnesses in a court case, all murdered. The Doukhobors became active in the 1920s and 30s. Again, most of the trouble was in their own community or also directed against school boards, but there was some real violence. There was a bomb on a train, and also as a personal note, my grandfather got a letter of commendation from the commissioner of the RCMI in 1935. He ran a gas station in Banff, but had helped the local detachment when 3 Doukhobors who had murdered a prison guard in Winnipeg were trying to make their way back to BC, got noticed on the edge of Banff National Park. There was a gunfight and all 3 of them were killed. We also, of course, had the Ku Klux Klan appear here right after the First World War. Again, something that's forgotten. There were no lynching episodes, but they did get around to trying to burn down a church in Montreal and dynamited a church in southwestern Ontario. They also, in a precursor to some activities we're seeing that developed in the 1990s, they were raising money to send it to the Mexican government, which at the time was involved in a civil war with Catholic rebels in Mexico. The 1940s and 50s seemed quiet enough, I think perhaps because we were preoccupied with other concerns. But the 1960s, things started to pick up again. We had the appearance of a neo-Nazi party, and then a whole series of right-wing extremist groups that followed in its wake. Right-wing extremism in Canada is rare and badly organized, but there are episodes of vandalism and physical assaults from the 1960s onwards, and you can probably read about the highest failed achievement of the radical right in Canada in Stuart Bell's The Bayou of Pigs. I strongly recommend it. It's tragic, but at the same time, it's hilarious. Anyway, I shouldn't dwell on it too much. Canadian leftists were fairly quiet and well behaved into the 1960s, but they've been heard from since. There was a lot more than to the story than the Squamish Five in 1982, or our 2 solidarity workers ending up in a kidnapping attempt in Brazil. Since the 1970s, actually one of the busiest Canadian terrorist groups is the Animal Liberation Front. They are responsible for dozens and dozens of incidents of vandalism and arson, and a little more, as two people in the room have good cause to know. Some of them progressed from minor stuff. And again, this was a case with a Toronto judge. He's got a couple of people from the Animal Liberation Front in front of him. They were spray painting slogans on a Kentucky Fried Chicken outlet, right? How dangerous is that? Slap on the wrist, away they go. Next time one of them was heard from, it's in the case of multi-million-dollar arson in the United States, severe economic damage. And he went on to other things after that. Likewise, the ecotage movement went beyond simple tree spiking and sabotaging park construction equipment, again, to attacks like the pipeline bombings of the Encana pipeline in 2008 and 2009, and occasionally multi-million-dollar arson attacks on construction sites. Anthony Kellett, in his article Terrorism in Canada for the journal of Violence in Canada, Sociopolitical, slip of the tongue, Sociopolitical Perspectives, cataloged 428 terrorist incidents in Canada from 1960 to 1989, about 14 a year. Like me, he used a rather tight definition of terrorism, but 143 of those incidents in that time involved our old favorites, the Doukhobors, who are now finally quiet, or so it seems. There are also 200 incidents from the FLQ. At one time in Montreal, they were averaging a bomb every 10 days. What was different, though, was that we also had a new feature in Canada after 1960, and that was newly arrived nationalist groups committing violence in pursuit of a conflict somewhere else, or a grievance somewhere else. The Armenians, the Croats, the Cubans, and the Barba Khalsa movement. All of them went beyond the usual pipe bomb Molotov cocktail technique we got used to. Now we had time bombs, an anti-tank rocket fired at the Cuban consulate in Montreal, attacks on embassy personnel, often gun attacks, the assassination of the Turkish defense attaché, for example, and the armed takeover of the Turkish embassy. The Barba Khalsa also set a new example in the 1980s. They set out to deliberately intimidate Canadian Sikhs and dominate the community, and were not above using murder to achieve this end. And just as a note, the Barba Khalsa is still around. There was a big Sikh rally in downtown Toronto, a festival, on the weekend. I cruised by on basically Sunday afternoon, or Saturday afternoon. They were still there. The Barba Khalsa supporters stayed at the end of the rally and basically put their stamp on it. There was a whole mess of them flying their flags, wearing their uniforms in front of the U.S. consulate and parading around the downtown core, quite unabashedly pointing out they're still here and they're willing to return. It makes them a group to continue to monitor. Aircraft bombs are not new in Canada. In fact, probably one of the first successful aircraft bombings ever was a murder plot that took place Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 108 in 1949. However, that wasn't terrorism. That was a gentleman who wanted to marry an 18-year-old girl seeking a cheap, high-explosive alternative to divorce. We still don't know who put the bomb on Canadian Airlines Pacific Flight 21 in 1965. That killed 52 people, and we're still not sure why. But Canadians always forgot about this. Barba Khalsa, the Air India bombing and the simultaneous Narita airport bombing, 331 people died in that day, a record that stood until the 9/11 attacks. We also had the occasional lone, I wouldn't say wolves, but lone something or other, using violence to make an obscure point of their own. In 1966, in the Parliament Hill, a washroom exploded. A bomb maker miswired his 10 sticks of dynamite before he got off and threw it on the floor of the House of Commons. Apparently, he didn't like politicians or homosexuals and had an MP in mind. We had a retired American military officer who bombed the Central Railroad station in Montreal in 1985 to protest the Pope's visit, killing 3 people and injuring about 50. No one might remember Loki 7, but he put out a series of pipe bombs in PEI and one in Halifax from 1988 to 1996. He's trying to represent himself as a white supremacist, but actually just admitted from prison in 2002. He just wanted revenge on society, and that was it. There are also a whole series of minor episodes that we still can't figure out. We still can't catalog them. For example, when the Armenians were active in Canada in the early 1980s, there was a Turkish restaurant in Toronto that got firebombed one night. Who did it and why? Was this an act of terrorism? We don't know. There's just not enough evidence. It would seem like a minor episode. The press never covered it. It's forgotten. This is part of our statistics or not. Who knows? There's the Tamil language broadcaster who refused to play ads for pro-LTTE ads, LTTE groups who got shot to death in his driveway in 1991. We can guess this is something to do with the Tamil Tigers. We really don't know. Again, is this terrorism or not? We just don't have enough to go on. The Animal Liberation Front is still busy as of last year, but are the eco tours at work? Are they still sabotaging stuff? No one's reporting it. The companies that are affected by it don't want it discussed. We have no idea if they're active or not. Well, the Barbara Khalsa might have dominated our attention tonight, or such attention as the Canadian public was prepared to give to terrorism in the 1980s. We had to be more concerned about the Tamil Tigers in the 1990s. They did something unusual. And a terrorist group taking advantage of an immigrant community is an old story of terrorism. What the Tamil Tigers did was different. They created an immigrant group. They created a diaspora from Sri Lanka so they could use it, control it, and use it to feed the homeland war. And the biggest community in the international diaspora was here in Toronto. Money being extorted from Canadian Tamils was being used to pay for a civil war in a country with which we had no grievance on the other side of the world. That is an example that we should be afraid someone else could copy. Again, we have our large communities here. Would Hezbollah be trying to do the same thing with the Lebanese Shia community, dominate them completely? There's some of you in this room who have a better idea of that than I don't, but if we're not working on that question, we should be learning the answer to it. Same thing again with ISIS, Daesh, and Al-Qaeda. Are they really trying to make inroads? Remember, with every terrorist group, there's a political or ideological front, and we're not even paying attention to the ideological front that was driving these Sunni extremist groups. They operate openly in Canada. They're not listed as a terrorist entity. We didn't pay that much attention to the jihad in the 1990s, despite learning that the planned exit route for the 1993 World Trade Center bombers lay through Canada. It was only after the French kept persisting in telling us that we had to pay attention to an Al-Qaeda cell in Montreal that we started to pay attention. And again, our people were fearlessly on the trail of Ahmed Rassam, usually a couple of days behind him when he tried to cross in the United States in 1999. And I can go on after 9/11, but again, we all know what's going on now, and there's no need to go over it. Well, we've always had lone wolves of one stripe or another. They currently seem more ambitious and deadly in technique than before. Previous terrorist groups used to be embarrassed by them, but with some of the groups now, especially ISIS or Daesh as we prefer, they only seem too happy in motivating and directing them. Also, with a larger population, we can expect more of them. And again, they're more ambitious. In 1970, when you were starting terrorists, you went and threw a Molotov cocktail through an empty store window. Now you work up a plan where you can kill dozens or even hundreds of people. And some of them, of course, have harbored ambitions of killing thousands. There is one point of success that so far the big spectacular acts of terrorism that we were all expecting after 9/11 haven't occurred in Canada. Mostly our story about terrorism in Canada in the last 15 years is what didn't occur. But in its own way, that's a good, I mean, it's not such good news if you really think about it. There is a terrible dilemma in counterterrorism. Success leads to complacency, which leads to vulnerability. I'm not going to imply that our frontline police and security officers are complacent about the threat or getting slack, because I know enough of you to know that's simply not true. but the public's interest and the political will, which feeds resources to you, is slackening. They think we're safe. And they'll continue to think that until we get seriously hurt. Terrorism, of course, is about both surprise and persistence. And the radical theater of the 1960s and 70s has retreated against a new lethality and a new sense of destructiveness. It is the fondest wish of Al-Qaeda and Daesh that they somehow launch an attack that kills thousands of us, or even more. One thing you should do in the study of should not do in the study of conflict is make firm predictions about the future, because you will inevitably be wrong. But it is only reasonable to assume, in a world that's getting more crowded, that we're going to see more terrorism from more sources and with new technologies. Remember, we're only beginning to see the fruits of the technological revolution in robotics, in the new life sciences, in nanotechnology. And again, the flip side, these new technologies, someone will figure out a way to turn them over and use them to cause serious harm. It's going to be an interesting century, and we better be prepared for it. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the RCMI for inviting me here today to talk, and I've decided to go the slide method of informing people about various different issues, and I hope this is a break in the process for the rest of the day. Interesting title, The Day the Jihad Came. Well, I was about to say that really we haven't had a jihad yet, but John's just made a complete liar of me, because he's just gone on over the last 100 years and said we've had this problem in Canada for many, many years. But the real jihad, I think, is still going to be coming very shortly. I'd like to talk about the future ramifications of these dates. I'm using these dates because this is when really it came home to us about what the problems we were going to be expecting over the next couple of years as a result of the growth of ISIS. And I'm not going to go through these, but they should still be fresh in everybody's mind, even people who do not follow terrorism, do not follow security, whatever the case may be. So, what are the ramifications of these things? These multiple and well-coordinated attacks really reveal the full extent to what is actually going on in the world today, particularly Syria and the Middle East in general. Add to that the mass immigration situation that the EU is now finding itself in, with hundreds of thousands of people trying to get away from what's going on in the Middle East, as well as Africa, Afghanistan, and a few of the other places as well. All these people are basically pushing their way into the West at a tremendous pace. And the repercussions of what is happening in the Middle East now is going to be felt for many, many years to come. And the question I'd like to propose is Canada prepared to respond to these types of attacks that we've had in Europe during the last 15 months? About 8 months ago, I was asked to speak at a conference which involved business continuity planners and those types of individuals. And this is the question that I asked, the very first slide that came out. What do you think are the greatest threats facing Canada today? That was what I put up. By the time I'd spent 2 minutes asking people about what happened, what they thought were the greatest threats, none of those were on that list. These were the individuals who plan all the crisis management planning for our provinces and our municipalities, and not one of what was on there was mentioned by these planners. Now remember, these are the guys we rely on to plan for the future. So that was slightly perturbed. The other thing was, although they didn't have any of these issues on their list when I went around the table, and there was like 95 people that attended this particular conference, I ended up speaking for nearly 2 hours from the podium, which really surprised me, because there was interest, they just hadn't thought about it before in the past. So what is our prevailing attitude to these types of threats? It's called the deny and repress syndrome. The deny and repress syndrome is we know there's a problem, but we say, well, it's not going to happen to us, so why worry about it? If something does happen, we go to the second syndrome, which is a reactionary response syndrome. And we've seen this many times throughout the last few years here in Canada. When something happens, the government will throw millions and millions of dollars, start all these organizations up, and then get them to actually do something about it after the fact. You don't think about putting things in place before there is an incident. We're very good at being reactive, we're not very good at being proactive. How do I know this? Because I've been in this business for 20 years in Canada, and I've spoken to municipalities, the province, and the federal government of various different countries around the world, and they all have the same feeling. We don't do anything really unless we have to, except for the US, of course, and the UK, because they've been dinged for many, many years in the past. So what's our response mechanism? One word. John mentioned it twice during his presentation: complacency. I have been in so many meetings over the last few years where the statement that's underneath, and I'll read that to you, after all, this is Canada, and nothing ever happens in Canada. Acts of terrorism occur in other countries, not Canada. That statement, hearing it time after time in my meetings over the previous few years, made me to decide to do something about it. And what I did, I recruited and I became a madrasa for a lone wolf terrorist. And if anyone wants to know this story, I will go into it later. I don't have time to do it now. But I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't wrong. And I wasn't wrong, because this individual did plan a major terrorist attack where we're standing now in Toronto. Heather Mallock, most of you know, she works for the Toronto Star. She said this in October of 2014, Canada doesn't seem to be prepared for any calamity. And in her article, she mentioned 4 or 5 different issues. And she's correct. We don't seem to be prepared for these types of calamities. Let me pose a what-if question. What about the Eaton Centre on Christmas Eve? All the families are roaming around, enjoying the Christmas thong, because tomorrow it's going to be Christmas Day, etc., etc. What happens if we have a situation occur in the Eaton Centre on Christmas Eve that's occurred in Europe in the last 12 months? What are we going to do? We can't stop it. But what are we going to do? What's our thought process is going to be like? We'll see a dramatic change of actions and decisions made by the government once this happened. But once again, I go back. Something has to happen before we can affect any type of change. Over the years, Canada has not been prepared for those: armed attack against Parliament, cyber, climate change, exploding oil tankers going through built-up areas, mentally ill people, First Nations issues, and domestic and international infectious diseases. So if we're not prepared for these things, how are we going to be prepared for terrorism? The quick answer is, we're not. So who is the enemy? We talked about all these different groups. A terrorist is a terrorist is a terrorist. Doesn't matter what they're called, everyone has a different name for all these groups. But at the moment, the number one, and I think both our previous speakers have mentioned this, is the global Islamist fundamentalist terrorist groups around the world. Every time a bus crashes on the road, it's got something to do with ISIS. The media thrive on this, as they did on Al-Qaeda for many, many years. What's the well-known saying in the TV reporter? They turn around and say, this has all the hallmarks of an Al-Qaeda attack. So now we've switched Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has taken a back seat. We now have ISIS, and they are the guys that are responsible for everything that goes wrong in the world today. So let's just talk a little bit about ISIS. They adopted a different approach. We have to remember that ISIS really was trying to recruit people to fight a war in Syria and to declare a caliphate by getting all these extra people from all over the world, 70 different countries, 80 different countries. It makes no difference. They had the ability to draw young men of military age to fight, kill, maim, rape and pillage in a different country, away from their own countries around the world. They believe that the best way to terrorize people in the West is through isometric terrorism. And we know this word has been used extensively over the years whilst we were located in Afghanistan and other places around the world. They have now made this a business. It's a major business opportunity. And now we're left to deal with a new threat, the elusive jihadist lone wolf. Canada should not be surprised by the advent of these individuals. We've been talking about them for many, many years. And all people who have an interest in terrorism or have a knowledge of terrorism are talking about this is going to be the new wave of attacks. Unfortunately, we've now seen it at its highest level in Europe. And what happens in Europe will eventually filter its way, one way or another, back over to this country. And obviously, this is a major concern. Are we planning for these types of things? We are attempting to plan for them. But in my next slide, I will talk about the fact how difficult it is to recognize this threat from our lone wolf terrorists. These individuals cannot be dealt with with existing counter-terrorism policies due to the very nature. One individual who gets radicalized, decides to perpetrate some type of attack, how are the intelligence services or law enforcement agencies going to know who these guys are? Because they're below the radar. And it is very, very difficult to actually start following these individuals, putting surveillance on them, and then getting information before they actually attack somebody. Usually with lone wolf terrorists, we don't know they exist except peripherally until they actually attack. Once again, we're being reactive as opposed to being proactive. And these individuals don't come in contact with routine counter-surveillance operations and surveillance. And this is what makes it very frustrating for our intelligence agencies and our police services. Just one slide on the security implications of mass migration from the Middle East. We now have hundreds of thousands of refugees coming from the Middle East, war zones and Africa. They have now had such an impact on the EU that they're looking at changing all their well-placed policies and procedures about allowing people a one-door access into 26 countries in Europe. This also is going to have an impact on us, and it's taken the EU about 6 months to really figure this out. They opened their arms and said, yes, we want to help these people. And of course we do, because a lot of these people are refugees, but a small percentage of these refugees are the bad guys. We have 25,000 refugees in Canada now, and there's more following over the next few years. So we could end up having some of the problems that EU has had in years to come. None of the countries in the Middle East are prepared to accept these refugees. Why? Why aren't they accepting them? They'd sooner push them into the West, where the majority of the refugees don't have the same culture, they don't have the same type of religion, and the same cultural values that the West has, and therefore they're going to face formidable barriers in trying to assimilate in all the various different countries where they eventually end up settling. So what are the answers? What dictates Canada's response capability? Our foreign policy is one, and I think we may see a dramatic change in our foreign policy with the new government that came in October. The fluid security environment also impacts on us as well, and our ability or inability to coordinate all our intelligence, law enforcement and response capabilities. We hear all the time from very different organizations in the various different governments, yes, we have our fusion cells, we have this cell, we have that cell. Are we truly integrated? Speak to the people involved in those cells and speak to the people who run those cells and you'll get a different story. And unfortunately now, the fight against ISIS is now being perceived by a lot of people all over the world as being the West versus Islam, which we all know it isn't. But that doesn't make any difference because using social media, ISIS has the ability to make it look as if it is that. So we must ask ourselves, obviously today's global security environment is uncertain. We can't predict everything. We can to a certain degree, and we can look at trends. We look about how they conducted their attacks in Paris and in Brussels. And they will learn from those attacks, as we are supposed to learn from how they did it and why we didn't get it triggered and why we didn't spot it, etc., etc. Is Canada prepared for these types of attacks in Canada? Are we learning from the experiences of our intelligence agencies and our law enforcement agencies in these other countries? Do we have the ability to think outside the logic box? From my perspective and my work that I do in Canada and overseas, this is the logic box and we have an inability to look outside of it. And I see this probably every other week when I go to certain meetings in very different organizations. Do we have the capability to respond to simultaneous terrorist attacks? We have exercises in Toronto with the fire department and the EMS, etc., etc. When do we ever exercise having multiple situations in different parts of the city? We rarely do that because it takes time, money, and we usually do it on a Sunday morning when there's no traffic in Toronto. Okay, so we're not really getting experience to be able to respond to these simultaneous types of attack. From my experience, we are not prepared, and very few organizations in the federal government, the provincial government, have comprehensive plans to deal with acts of terrorism, future-related attacks. Additionally, most of the corporations I speak to, not only in Canada, but also in other countries as well, they haven't even thought that terrorism should be on their list of things to do. It's something that when it happens, we'll deal with it, so we don't plan for it. Some of the things we have to bear in mind after what I've said so far. Canada has to be capable of defending two things. First is the lives of all its citizens, and the liberal values of tolerance and the rule of law that underpins our society here today. When these two issues are in conflict, we have a problem. Okay, because we usually find that one gets prioritized against the other. And sadly, when we're trying to scramble to plan security, that's the first thing that seems to go, and human rights takes over, etc., etc. We need to be able to blend the two together, which we have been relatively able to do, but once we have a major attack, it'll be very different. You'll see two sides will split away from normal people in the street. Legal powers. The jihadists are often radicalized online. They communicate electronically, and they travel, they leave a trail. Our intelligence services need controlled access to this data. We can't allow the terrorists to thrive on this lack of security and allow or try to have our security and intelligence services actually break the law or abuse their powers to get this type of information. It should be made available to them. Once again, we're coming into human rights issues as well. By contrast, if we start closing our borders down and inhibit refugees and other immigrants to come to this country, obviously this undermines our human rights significantly. And despite this, obviously the flow of all future refugees must be effectively controlled, particularly from certain countries. That's called stereotyping, unfortunately. We have to look at various different people in various different countries. So to conclude, planning for people needs to be our top priority. We can rebuild buildings, we can rebuild aircraft, we can't rebuild people. All hazard approaches must be, for planning, should be essential. Employing a visible combination of manpower and technology is vital as well, and we must develop the ability to think outside the box. I'm sorry I keep regurgitating that saying, but it's so true. And when I sit in meetings, unfortunately, I'm sitting there going, oh my God. Okay, so it does happen. Security protocols need to be in place to protect people, processes, systems, and assets. It is expected that the next wave of terrorist attacks are going to involve suicide bombers or non-suicide bombers, active shooting type of scenarios in places where many people congregate. Why is that? It's because we can't really protect people when they go to ball games, when they're shopping, when they're in shopping malls, etc., etc. They are easy targets for terrorists of all stripes, depending on the ability of them to get all the weapons and explosives, etc., etc. The number of suicide attacks is continuing to rise. It's very difficult to be able to sort of put statistics to this, but I tried to do this about a year ago. And between 2013 and 2014, there were more than 1,251,000 suicide attacks in over 23 countries that killed nearly 6,000 people and wounded tens of thousands of others. So this is going on. And we are Canada, and we don't have this happening in Canada now, but there is a very good chance this could happen in the future. In short, we have done too little, too late, and our responses to acts of terrorism have largely been limited to responding after the fact. It's time we've got to stop chasing this threat. We need to get ahead of the curve. And there's people who are far more intelligent than I am in our intelligence services, our law enforcement agencies, and one would like to think in our federal and provincial governments who are thinking outside the logic box when it comes to this. We have been given time to prepare for respond to future terrorist attacks. We shouldn't waste this time, what we have been doing over the last 4 or 5 years, unfortunately. Intelligence, planning and vigilance are fundamental to thwarting future terrorist attacks to Canada. Thank you very much.
The front end of your presentation, you mentioned what you thought to this group of people were the shopping list of issues that that group should be concerned about. What were they concerned about?
Flooding. One individual said an earthquake. I asked, we had an earthquake in Canada. He said 2 weeks ago we had an earthquake in Sudbury. I asked him how many buildings were damaged and how many people were injured or killed. He said nobody. I said, so that's where you're focusing. I had another lady who talked about water shortages. I said, we live on the Great Lakes. We were more likely to have to fight a war to keep people away from our water than we are to run out of this water. And the whole of this conference, I was looking forward to speaking to these guys because I really lost contact with what these guys do for a living. And they plan for all our cities and all our small municipalities on what to do when things go wrong. And all those issues I brought up on that second slide were not on the things to do list. And that really shocked me. I was so surprised. And in fact, I was frightened.
Take questions from the floor. Yes, please, sir.
We presented the problem, and we presented the problem here today, and I just keep thinking of this old saying that when you come to a fork in the road, take it. What is our government at all levels doing? I mean, provincially, we just closed a gas plant and wasted $1 billion. All of this preparedness requires money, but yet we still continue to waste it, and we haven't even identified the problems. We have an agreement with NATO, which I think is part and parcel of keeping our country secure and intelligence gathering. And we spend, I think, we were required to spend 2% of our GDP as a contribution to NATO. We're down to below 1%. And as a sovereign country, I find that embarrassing. And this all speaks to how we prepare ourselves for these security risks. And I think we have right now such an open door policy that I'm thinking of putting a 50 mil turret in the bottom of my farm driveway because it's getting ridiculous. I mean, we just live in this glass house, and I, for one, am very fearful. And I also respect the comment that the gentleman on the left made. I forgot your name. I apologize. And you know, what comes through Canada to the United States impacts us as well. I think that is a much more significant concern of ours. So what do we do? I mean, here we all are coming to listen to these experts talk about preparedness. How do we get this communicated to our politicians?
Well, they're thinking, you know, all politics are local. And if it's the group in Sudbury that Alan was speaking to, unless they've been impacted by an event, they've been conditioned to it, it's not going to hit them. We all know there are a lot of ex-politicians and politically inclined people in this room that understand that. It's a function of resourcing based upon perceived, most likely, the balancing of threats. So, Andy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Sometimes it's the question that's next to impossible to answer. I guess I go back to my colleagues and some of the comments that they made before, is sometimes our ability to disrupt attacks actually minimizes the understanding of the general population of the likelihood of those attacks taking place. I harken back to the Toronto 18 that myself and one of my former colleagues in the room were deeply involved in. Had they succeeded, this came out at the criminal trial, the estimate was that they would have killed upwards of 3,000 people. It was very, very close to succeeding. As horrific as it sounds, had they killed 35 or 3,000 people, what would the impact of that would be? How would we respond? Did we learn anything to be able to be proactive by stopping an event? Unfortunately, I just don't think it's in the human psyche sometimes to be able to say, well, this is going to happen to us. You saw those quotes about how Canadians view the the threat to their own security. Unfortunately, when you're on the other side of the wizard's curtain, you see things and hear things. And as I said, the threat is very real. It's immediate, it's expanding, and we need to be able to be in a position to respond to it and to have the legal capability, the wherewithal, and the resources to respond. But, I'll give you the classic example. When I was with the service, we got a massive influx of money and resources in the mid-2000s. And then 2 years later, through the draft program in the federal government, they just took them away again. They actually took away more than we actually never got it in the first place. It was a card game. And that happens all the time. It's very easy to cut security because it's not hitting you between the eyes. And it's having an understanding and as Alan was saying, to be able to forecast and look ahead.
I'd like to give you an example about governments. I was at the big house at the top of University Avenue about 7 years ago talking to a minister with a colleague, and I asked him why we weren't being more proactive in what we do. And this is the answer, and I tell this story many times, but I'll tell it very briefly, I don't have a lot of time. Politicians do not get kudos for giving money before there's an event. They get their kudos and their popularity after the event by handing away millions and millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to all these agencies and organizations around. So I said, well, why don't we do it to help them become more proactive when these type of... And we weren't talking about terrorism, by the way, either. Okay, it wasn't terrorism, this was another totally different issue. And that's a remark from a minister. He holds the money and he's not prepared to release that money to allow us to become more proactive. He prefers to wait until it hits the fan, and then he'll give all these millions of dollars away, he'll sign the checks. And that still happens today, in 2016.
Hello, my name is Mark Baker, and I do business continuity consulting. I'm a business continuity professional. One of the things I think you have to be aware of when you are dealing with sort of Joe Average company is that they will look after, or they should be looking at the events that may hit them. So they should be looking at something as a fire and producing plans that perhaps could handle fire in their IT room before they start going after a terrorism event. And one of the issues that I have with all of these things, and not just terrorism events, but fire and, as you pointed out, flood, is that our risk assessment process is frankly god-awful. When I deal with my clients, they will be panicky over terrorism because of something they saw on the news. They will be panicky over a pandemic because of something they saw on the news. And then it just fades as time fades. Some will do proper response, some will not. So, basically you have to do a proper risk assessment as a private corporation to figure out what you're vulnerable to. Don't look for a flood if you're not on a floodplain, something flooding you out in your 34th story or whatever. Though maybe you should look at it because you've got a sprinkler system. But I think our risk assessment process is just awful. The other thing is some companies are doing what they're supposed to in some organizations. For example, DREAM, the Disaster Recovery Information Exchange, did a VX nerve gas exercise a couple of years ago with the city and with BOMA, the Building Owners and Management Association. So some people are doing what they should do, some are not. It's very, very spotty is the response. And that's what I think we should be careful of, is not just broad brush saying no one's doing anything, because some people are. It's just not being done perhaps as well as it should be. And again, I always harp back on risk assessment because that seems to be the worst part of it. Thank you.
Actually, that comes to a point, though. I mean, terrorism happens very rarely, but things like crime happen almost every day. And the preparations that you make for spectacular events will often pay for themselves in routine events. I mean, closed-circuit television are valuable in counterterrorism. They also work every day. They spot 1,000 different things. If you have an evacuation plan for your principals, again, that works if something like a fire alarm goes off. All the preparations for spectacular events pay off for much more common ones.
And works the other way as well.
Exactly.
All I can say, just to sort of move on to the next question, is the fact that my experience, and I deal with most of these companies you're talking about, both domestically and internationally, until something happens, they don't think about planning for it. You'll get, your average Canadian street will read what happened in the Philippines 24 hours ago and say, oh my God, isn't that terrible? And then today, Philippines, where is that? So that's the type of pervasive. We are very complacent here in Canada, and I wouldn't live anywhere else. Don't get me wrong. I'm a transplanted Brit, and I'm an immigrant myself. But I get very frustrated, and I get very, I wouldn't say use the word aggressive or verbally, probably it is. It does come over as that. When I listen to very intelligent people tell me stupid things because they don't really know. No one's expecting anyone to go out and plan for a major terrorist attack or another 911. But as John said, I mean, there's little things that happen. Active shooter now is the key word. How many police forces in Canada have got active shooter policies? I will bet you all of them have. Why? Because it's a big, high-value issue. We don't want our schools invaded by guys with guns, etc., etc. So they've dealt with that straight away. I know from a police force that we audited 2 years ago, that was their biggest priority. Terrorism, they weren't interested in. Active shooter in a school or in a public building, that was where they focused their time and efforts. So you're right, you can't cast aspersions against all companies and all business professionals. But my experience, unfortunately, has been on the other side.
This is a question that probably should be better addressed to Ralph Goodale, but as it happens, just a week ago, there was a debate in Toronto in another venue on the subject of whether the terrorism threat in Canada is exaggerated. And the debate was between Jonathan Kay of the Walrus and the former Minister for Immigration, Chris Alexander. And the question was posed then, and I'm going to repose it. What is our social threshold of tolerance of terrorist events? How many deaths is too many?
That's a loaded question. There always has to be a balance between keeping society safe and secure and giving people a sense of well-being, and recognizing and appreciating and informing that same population of the nature of the threat. If I were to err on one side or the other, exaggerate or underreported, I think I would err slightly on the side of underreported. I don't think that the average Canadian understands what's out there. I don't think the average Canadian understands the potential that exists and how quickly these events can come to pass. As I said before, an Al-Qaeda attack took a long time to happen, but it was mass casualty, world-changing. What we see with organizations like Daesh is it can happen in an instant. So how do you cast your net? How do you play your defense? You need to be more creative and innovative. But I think as well, I think the average member of Canadian society should understand that if you looked at Michel Zayef-Bevo a week before he did his heinous act on Parliament Hill, how much effort would you put on him? How many resources would you deploy to him? When you've got 20, 30, 50 people who've returned from combat and have returned to this country, and you've got a guy who's a little angry because he didn't get his passport. That's the challenge. It's understanding, having people understanding and to be vigilant and to share that information with the authorities and law enforcement and security intelligence, and to set up systems in place to be able to be predictive of those events taking place. We can't set up systems and be predictive if we don't recognize there's a problem. You know, it's a bit like someone saying the first way to defeat alcoholism is to say, I'm an alcoholic. The first way, I think, to defeat the threat that we're facing now in terms of terrorism or in terms of cyber is understanding that a menace exists, a reasonable appreciation of the menace, and devising a response to ensure that that menace isn't visited upon you.
Time, two more questions. Tim Lynch, then followed by Ted Lennox in the back.
Andy Ellis, I like the name Andy Ellis. I'd like to, in your presentation, you mentioned radicalization. And then you said the police and the security really haven't moved into this. It's outside our box. I'm really perhaps got a two-part question to you. Is there any attempted measure of security? Is it the dimension that's ever been attempted to measure? So, like, you know, high crime rate and the low crime rate neighborhood. And we're okay in these areas. We've got very comfortable walking in certain areas, certain neighborhoods, others not so comfortable. I'd like to know from your community, have you ever attempted a methodology that has actually measured security? And my second part of the question is, radicalization, do you see that as a national security threat? Or do you see it as a community health concern? Maybe you could sort of give us some enlightenment.
Let me speak to the second point first. I think it's both. I think we'd be naive to say that it is just a community health concern and it's not a national security threat because, again, if this violence is visited upon society and it's visited for the purposes for which they're doing it, it becomes a national security risk. What we haven't done well in this country is to build vigilance and to build relationships from the federal to the provincial to the municipal, from everybody having a role and a function in trying to deal with these types of issues. It goes from violence and radical behavior on the internet to people who are meeting in public places, to the impact that these people are having on schools, on centers, often kind of theoretical. They're not recognized religious centers by any means. But this requires a response at all levels. We are behind in Canada, behind, I can certainly say in terms of some of our colleagues in Western Europe, in the United Kingdom, for example. One of the things that the British have started to do, and I think it's brilliant, is to involve family courts. If, for example, a mother or father or both are drug addicts, the first thing very quickly law enforcement would do, and Children's Aid Society and everything else, they would involve themselves in the process to say it's not right that this child is in an environment where he's being or she's being exposed to this kind of behavior. The question is, how do we define that kind of behavior elsewhere? Where is it reasonable to have a child exposed to extreme violent radicalization? What is that? How do you define that? And when you do, when does the government at various levels, when do social services agencies? This is a really difficult question, but we haven't even started to ask it yet. In terms of your other point, I guess we don't measure security as much as we do risk. The Integrated Terrorist Assessment Center that's in Ottawa, and it's made up of a whole range of different federal departments, measures the terrorist risk to this country all the time. They look at a whole bunch, it's a very scientific, methodological way of doing it. In early October of 2014, we raised the threat level from low to medium, and 2 weeks later, Parliament Hill and Saison happened. They're very good at what they do, and we share with our Five Eyes partners and our European and Asian partners as well to find a better methodology. Because it goes into exactly what we were talking about before. It's finding a way to measure risk that's real and evident, and where precisely is that? Because is the risk to Canada medium? Okay. Is the risk to Edmonton the same as the risk to Hamilton? And how should that be conveyed? And how is that information conveyed from the federal to the provincial to the municipal level? That's an area that we need to work on.
Good morning. My name is Ted Lennox. My question really pertains to the medium or the media and the way in which terrorism is brought to bear on the public. Do you, Mr. Ellis, or could you comment on potential regulation or the need to regulate the internet at some point in the future, and that we might be forced to do that? Is that something that it's a very, very difficult question both directions, I realize that. But regulation of the means of communicating, both recruiting and disseminating the terrorist message, that's going to be a significant issue to talk about or consider.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we'll ever be able to do that, given the fact that the internet is a medium beyond the Canadian borders and beyond the borders of many of our friends and allies. I think what we need to do is to establish standards, some sort of standard for acceptable behavior. And more importantly, and both of my colleagues mentioned it before, and this comes up to a very difficult debate, the debate between mobile phone companies and the FBI in terms of getting access to different programs and getting access to controlled devices. It's a very difficult question, but what we need to be able to do is establish standards, establish legal standards, and then hold people accountable to do that, to that, and then be able to identify those people. Find a way to say, that person, that type of behavior is beyond the law, and if someone does that type of behavior, they can be brought before the courts. But the piece that we're missing is, who's that person? And I'm telling you, there's a lot of apps and programs out there that are designed on purpose, never ever to give that up. Their business model is designed to be so encrypted, they can't decrypt it. There is no key. And in one case, it was on 60 Minutes a few weeks ago, a company in Germany has I call it the Mission Impossible button. It self-destructs the message and totally destroys any forensic trail that it leaves. So it's finding out, setting standards, holding people accountable to that standards, and figuring out who those people are, and having some understanding and appreciation in Canada and in Western countries of how far we're willing to go, the privacy versus the governance of